The blueprints of the Blackwood Manor did not match the structure that stood before me. I discovered the discrepancy on my third day of ownership, while sitting in the overgrown courtyard with a cup of black coffee and the faded, yellowed parchment spread out across a rusted iron table. The estate was an imposing three-story structure of blackened timber and hand-cut gray stone, bought for pennies at an auction after sitting empty for nearly 40 years. I was a writer of historical fiction, looking for the kind of absolute, isolating quiet that only a dead man's home could provide. But the silence here was not empty. It was dense. I ran my finger over the architect's sketch of the second floor. According to the original 1894 drawings, the eastern facade possessed exactly 4 arched windows. Yet, when I looked up from the parchment toward the towering stone wall, my eyes counted 5. The 5th window was positioned perfectly between the master bedroom and the small library at the end of the hall. From the courtyard, it looked entirely normal. Thick, dark panes of antique glass held in place by lead casing, a heavy mahogany frame weathered by decades of winter frost, and a dark velvet curtain drawn tightly across the interior. I set my coffee down, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I walked inside, climbing the creaking oak staircase to the second floor. The air upstairs was always a few degrees colder than the ground floor, smelling of old cedar, dry dust, and the faint, unmistakable scent of damp earth. I stood in the narrow corridor, pacing the distance between the master bedroom door and the library entrance. 22 paces. I walked back, running my hand along the thick, floral-patterned wallpaper that covered the interior wall. There was no door here, no alcove, no hidden panel, just a solid, unbroken expanse of stone and lath and plaster. According to the internal dimensions of the house, the space behind that wallpaper was a dead zone, a hollow pocket of air exactly 6 feet wide and 10 feet deep. A sealed room. I reached out and pressed my palm against the wallpaper where the 5th window should have been. The wall was freezing cold, far colder than the masonry surrounding it. As I held my breath, straining my ears in the heavy silence of the empty manor, I felt it. Thump! It was a faint, heavy vibration beneath the lath and plaster, like the slow, rhythmic beat of a massive, resting heart. I pulled my hand back, my fingers tingling with a strange static-like numbness. It's just the timbers settling. I muttered aloud, the sound of my voice thin and fragile against the silence of the house. The stone is cooling down, but the explanation fell hollow. I went down to the kitchen and returned with a heavy, steel-headed claw hammer and a small utility knife. I began to cut away the antique wallpaper. The floral pattern peeled away in large, stiff flakes, revealing the gray, crumbling plaster beneath. The air in the corridor immediately filled with a fine, white dust that tasted like chalk and old iron. I took the hammer, raised it over my shoulder, and struck the center of the wall. Crack! The plaster gave way with a dry, splintering sound. I expected to hit solid brick or timber supports, but the hammerhead punched clean through into an empty void. A sudden sharp draft of freezing air rushed out from the hole, hitting my face. It smelled of wet copper, stagnant water, and ancient rot. I coughed, waving the dust away, and pointed the beam of my phone's flashlight into the opening. The space behind the wall was not empty. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the interior side of the 5th window. The dark velvet curtain I had seen from the outside was there, but it was hanging in tattered, rotted shreds from a rusted brass rod. The floor of the hidden room was made of raw, unpolished cedar planks that were wet with a thick, yellowish sap that oozed up from the cracks. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. Sitting directly in front of the window, its back turned toward me, was a chair. A high-backed, Victorian armchair made of dark, water-stained walnut. And resting on the armrests were two long, pale objects. They looked like human arms, but they were too long, their skin the color of lard and covered in a fine, dark fuzz like the roots of a weed. The fingers were multi-jointed, long and spindly, tapping against the wood with a slow, mechanical rhythm. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, freezing into tiny, white clouds in the sudden cold of the corridor. The figure in the chair did not turn around, but the tapping stopped. Entry 426, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the room. It came from the walls of the corridor behind me, the sound vibrating through the lath and plaster like a direct telegraph signal. It was a voice I recognized, a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years. It was the flat, clinical tone of my old university professor, Dr. Eris, who had gone missing in these same mountains during a research expedition. The subject has breached the perimeter, the voice rattled from the baseboards. He has exposed the false glass. He doesn't know that the glass doesn't look out into the woods. The glass looks into the marrow. I backed away from the hole, the hammer trembling in my hand. "Who's in there?" I shouted, my voice cracking as it echoed down the empty hallway. The fingers on the armrest did not move, but the high-backed chair began to turn. It didn't turn with the smooth, easy swivel of modern furniture. It rotated with a heavy, wet scraping sound, the walnut legs dragging across the sap-slick cedar planks. The figure face came into the beam of my flashlight. It had no eyes. In the sockets where human eyes should have been, there were two small, perfectly circular window panes of antique glass, held in place by dark, scarred tissue that looked like dried lead casing. Behind the glass, instead of pupils, there was only a swirling, chaotic mass of black static. Its mouth was a jagged, toothless slit that stretched from ear to ear, held open by two rusted iron hooks that were anchored into its jawbone. "Mark," the creature whispered, the voice now changing, taking on my own exact tone and cadence. "Why did you break the plaster?" It was so dark. It was so quiet. Now the air is getting in. Now the signal is getting through. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own boots and falling against the opposite wall. The wallpaper behind my back felt warm, vibrating in sympathy with the creature's words. The thing in the chair began to rise. Its legs were impossibly thin, its knees bending at unnatural, sharp angles as it lifted its 9-foot frame toward the small hole I'd carved in the plaster. Its branch-like fingers reached through the opening, the tips brushing against the edges of the wallpaper. "Don't run, Mark," the creature said, using my mother's voice now, soft, comforting, and terrifyingly clear. "Your father is waiting for you behind the glass. He's been sitting here since the winter of '98. He just needs a little bit of your heat to turn the dial." I scrambled to my feet, dropped the hammer, and bolted down the stairs. The dragging, wet scraping sound followed me, moving along the ceiling of the first floor with the speed of a hunting spider. I reached the front door, my fingers clawing at the heavy iron bolts. Click, thud. I pulled the door open and threw myself out onto the gravel yard. The afternoon sun was still high in the sky, its golden light washing over the dark stones of the manor. I looked up at the eastern facade. The fifth window was still there, but the dark velvet curtain was gone. Standing behind the antique glass was the pale, tall figure. Its face was pressed directly against the window pane, its circular glass eyes reflecting the sun with a blinding, violent glare. And as I watched, it raised one long, multi-jointed finger and pressed it against the glass. "Top! Top! Top!" It was writing something on the fog of its own breath. 2 words, reversed so I could read them from the courtyard. "Stay inside." The gravel of the courtyard dug into my palms as I sat on the ground, staring up at the second floor. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the dark pines, bathing the manor's stone walls in a sickly, blood-red hue. The two words written on the frosted glass, "Stay inside," remained there for several minutes before the condensation faded, leaving only the dark, swirling static behind the figure's glass eyes. The pale silhouette slowly receded into the shadows of the sealed room until there was nothing left to see but the tattered, rotted remains of the velvet curtain. My hand was shaking so violently that I could barely push myself up. Every instinct screamed at me to run to my car, to drive down the dirt road and never look back. I stumbled toward my sedan, my fingers fumbling with the keys. I unlocked the door, threw myself behind the steering wheel, and twisted the ignition. Click! Nothing. I tried again, pressing my foot down on the gas pedal. The starter motor let out a dry, pathetic whine that died almost immediately. I popped the hood and ran to the front of the car, coughing as the heavy, metallic smell of old copper and wet dirt hit my nose. The battery was completely ruined, but it hadn't just drained. The thick plastic casing had cracked open, and a viscous, yellowish fluid, the exact same sap that was oozing from the cracks of the false window, was dripping onto the engine block. The car was dead. I was 4 miles from the nearest paved road, and the village of Blackwood was completely empty. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the long, creeping shadows of the forest were reaching out for the manor like dark, multi-jointed fingers. Stay inside. The creature's message echoed in my mind. As much as I feared the house, the thought of being caught out in the open when the darkness fell was worse. The old man from my dreams, the one who had warned me about the tall one in the village, had been clear. The woods have a memory, and they don't like to be forgotten. I walked back into the house, my boots echoing loudly in the silent hallway. I locked the front door, sliding the heavy iron bolts into their brackets. Click! Thud! Thud! The ground floor was dark, the corners already swallowed by a deep, impenetrable gloom. I lit the single candle in the brass holder and sat down on the floor of the parlor, pulling a heavy wool blanket around my shoulders. For the first 3 hours, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the heavy wooden shutters. But as the clock struck midnight, the true nature of the sealed room began to reveal itself. It started as a rhythmic, sliding noise inside the walls. S-H-H-H-H-Gay, S-H-H-H-H-Gay, S-H-H-H-H-Gay. It sounded like dry newspaper being dragged through a narrow pipe. Something was moving inside the lath and plaster, descending from a second floor toward the ground level. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the wall where the old chimney rose through the ceiling. The wallpaper began to bulge. A pale, thin line moved beneath the floral pattern, twisting like a worm beneath skin. It traveled down the corner of the room, stopped at the baseboard, and then began to circle the parlor. Entry 427. A voice whispered from the baseboards. It was my father's voice. It was clear, deep, and carried that familiar, gentle resonance that I hadn't heard since I was a child. The boy is sitting on the floor, Mark. He has his mother's eyes, but he carries the iron in his marrow. Tell him to look behind the skirting board. Tell him that the paper isn't holding the stone together. I clutched the hammer to my chest, my knuckles turning white. You're not him. I whispered into the dark, my voice cracking. You died in the hospital. I was there. The hospital was just a broadcast, Mark, the voice replied from the wall. The volume dropped, becoming more intimate, as if the speaker were sitting right next to me on the rug. The bed, the tubes, the long, flat line. It was just a signal that had nowhere else to land. The real me is here. I'm sitting in the dark walnut chair, looking through the antique glass. My eyes are so clear now, Mark. I can see the veins in your neck. The scraping sound inside the walls grew louder, more frantic. I looked down at the gap between the floorboards and the skirting board. A thin, dark root, thick as a man's finger and wet with that sulfur-smelling sap, forced its way into the parlor. It moved blindly along the edge of the floor, its tip twitching as it sensed the warmth of the candle flame. I scrambled back, my heel catching on the old woven rug. I picked up the rusted coffee tin filled with salt and iron filings that my grandmother had left in the kitchen. I threw a handful directly at the root. The moment the salt hit the wet wood, the tendril let out a high-pitched, metallic squeal. It recoiled instantly, curling back into the wall like a worm on a hot iron stove. But from above my head, a heavy thump shook the ceiling beams. The dragging steps were back. The figure from the false window was pacing the second-floor corridor right above the parlor. Creak, creak, creak. It wasn't just walking, it was testing the wood. With every heavy step, the cracks in the ceiling plaster widened. A thin, dark line appeared directly above the horsehair sofa, and a thick drop of that yellowish sap dripped down, landing on the fabric with a soft splat. "Mark!" A different voice whispered from the ceiling. It was my mother's voice. "He's almost through the floor, Mark. The lath is thin here. The wood is rotting from the inside. If you don't go to the cellar, the whole house will fall." The cellar. The word made my blood run cold. My grandmother had warned me about the cellar in her letters, but I had ignored it. I had assumed it was just the rambling of an old woman. But now, with the ceiling cracking above me and the walls moving with pale, multi-jointed roots, it was the only part of the house I hadn't explored. I grabbed the candle, the flame flickering violently in the sudden draft that was blowing from the hole in the parlor wall. I hurried down the hallway, my boots slipping on the floorboards as the wood continued to groan and pop. I reached the small, dark door beneath the stairs. I pulled it open. A wave of freezing, ozone-scented air hit my face, making my eyes water. The narrow stone steps led down into a pitch-black abyss that smelled of wet iron, stagnant pond water, and old blood. "Go down, Mark," the voice from the walls whispered. This time it was the collective voice of the village, 100 broken throats speaking in unison. "The seal is still on the door. The iron is still cold. Go down before the tall one looks down from the ceiling." I took a step onto the slippery stone. Behind me, in the parlor, the ceiling gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. A massive, pale limb crashed through the plaster, its long fingers reaching for the rug where I had been sitting just seconds ago. I didn't look back. I slammed the door shut and bolted it from the inside, plunging myself into the cold dark of the cellar steps. The stone steps felt like blocks of river ice beneath my boots. As I descended deeper into the earth, the frantic thumping from the parlor above began to fade, replaced by a hollow, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a mechanical pulse, slow, deliberate, and ancient. I held the brass candle holder in my right hand, the flame reduced to a tiny, blue-tinged spark that danced wildly in the freezing draft. My phone's battery had died hours ago, leaving me with only this fragile, flickering light against the darkness that felt physically heavy, pressing against my eyes like a wet cloth. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was different. It didn't smell like the rot of the upper floors. It smelled of deep earth, sharp ozone, and the distinct, bitter tang of raw iron shavings. I stepped onto the dirt floor of the cellar. The beam of my small candle cut through the gloom, reflecting off walls made of massive, irregular stones. These weren't modern foundation blocks. They were ancient boulders, hauled from the surrounding mountains and stacked without mortar. Every single stone was covered in a thick, dry crust of white salt and fine iron dust. And carved into the center of the floor was a massive circle. The lines were deep, carved directly into the bedrock, and filled with a dark, dried substance that gave off the faint, metallic scent of blood. Within the circle sat a heavy, iron-bound oak door, laid flat against the ground like the lid of a tomb. A massive iron beam was laid across the flat door, held in place by two heavy brackets bolted directly into the stone floor. It looked exactly like the seal my grandmother had written about in her journal. Click, click, click. The sound didn't come from the flat door. It came from the shadows behind me. I whirled around, the candle flame sputtering. In the corner of the cellar, sitting behind a small, rusted iron table, was the dark walnut chair from the second floor. But the chair was empty. Lying on top of the rusted table was a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked and stained with that same yellowish sap that was oozing from the walls upstairs. Entry 428. A voice rattled from the stone wall behind the table. It was the dry, academic voice of Dr. Eris again. The subject has reached the lower circuit. He has found the anchor. He doesn't understand that the house isn't built on stone. The house is built on the tall one's collarbone. I walked toward the table, my boots crunching on the coarse salt that covered the dirt floor. My hand was shaking so badly that the brass candle holder clattered against the iron top of the table. I reached out and opened the ledger. The pages were brittle, covered in my grandmother's spidery, frantic handwriting. The fifth window is not a window, the first line of the page read. It is a lens. It takes the memories of the people who enter the house and projects them into the wood. The roots drink the signal. They use it to manufacture the voices. To stop the transmission, the lens must be shattered from the inside of the sealed room. But to enter the sealed room, you must draw the beam from the floor. I looked back at the flat door in the center of the cellar. The iron beam was covered in a thin layer of white frost. As I watched, the oak wood beneath the iron flexed upward, the heavy planks groaning under a massive pressure from below. "Mark!" A voice whispered from the cracks in the flat door. It was my mother's voice again, but it was weak, sounding as if she were speaking through a long, narrow tube. "The iron is too cold, Mark. It's pressing against my throat. Please lift the beam. Your father and I are just beneath the stone. We have our childhood photos. We have the keys to the old car. You're not down there," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the freezing cellar. "You're just the roots." The flat door groaned again, more violently this time. A thick, dark root, as wide as a man's leg, forced its way up through the dirt at the edge of the circle. It moved like a blind serpent, its tip covered in tiny, twitching fibers that reached toward the warmth of my candle. Entry 429. The creature's voice boomed from the walls, the overlapping, fractured storm of 100 broken throats. The anchor is failing. The salt is dissolving. You cannot keep the lens covered forever, Mark. The sun is gone. The forest is awake. Pull the beam and become the new anchor. I looked down at the ledger in my hands. There was a final note written at the bottom of the page, scrawled in red ink. If you pull the beam, the figure from the window will come down. It will use the open door to go back into the earth. You will have exactly 3 minutes to climb to the second floor and break the glass of the fifth window before the roots reclaim the stairs. If you fail, the house will become your skin. I dropped the book onto the iron table. The scratching in the walls was returning, louder now, coming from the ceiling of the cellar. The floorboards above me were popping and splintering as the tall one forced its way down through the lath and plaster. I had no choice. I couldn't stay in the cellar, and I couldn't go back up to the first floor while the entity held the stairs. I walked to the center of the circle. I knelt on the cold, damp dirt and gripped the frozen iron beam with both hands. The moment my skin touched the metal, a wave of profound, electrical cold shot up my arms, freezing the breath in my lungs. My fingers felt like they were being welded to the iron. "Pull, Mark!" The voices from the walls shrieked. Pull the beam and let the signal through. I gritted my teeth, planting my boots in the dirt, and lifted. Crack! The iron beam popped out of its brackets with a sound like a thunderclap. The flat door beneath it immediately flew open, swinging upward on its rusted hinges to reveal a yawning, pitch-black pit that smelled of ozone and boiling sap. And from the darkness of the stairs behind me, a wet, dragging step began to move downward. The tall one had heard the seal break. It was coming down to the pit. The cold that rushed out from the open pit was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just the absence of heat. It was a hungry, aggressive freeze that turned the moisture on my eyelashes into ice and extinguished my candle instantly. The dark was immediate, thick, and suffocating. I scrambled backward on all fours, my hands scraping against the coarse, iron-dusted salt. The dirt floor seemed to vibrate beneath me. From the dark opening of the pit came a long, drawn-out sound, like air being sucked into a wet sponge. Sluck, sluck, sluck. The roots below were expanding. I could hear the thick, pale tendrils scraping against the walls of the pit as they stretched toward the surface. But that sound was quickly drowned out by a heavier, more terrifying impact on the stone stairs behind me. The tall one was at the top of the cellar steps. Thump, creak, thump. It moved with a sickening, disjointed gait. I didn't need light to know it was approaching. The odor of wet copper and rotten pine was overpowering, filling the cramped cellar until I was gagging into my sleeve. Entry 430. The creature's voice rasped from the dark, just a few feet away. It was my old university professor again, but the tone was distorted, sounding as if the speaker were drowning. The subject has removed the iron. The door is clear. The circuit is open, and the marrow is calling. He has exactly 2 minutes and 40 seconds left before the timber fuses. I didn't wait to hear more. Using my memory of the room's layout, I launched myself toward the side of the cellar, my fingers brushing against the rough, salt-crusted stones of the wall. I found the edge of the stone steps just as a massive, freezing draft blew past my face. The thing had reached the dirt floor. I heard the wet, heavy sound of its long limbs dragging across the ground, moving directly toward the open pit in the center of the circle. It was ignoring me for the moment, drawn to the open earth like a needle to a magnet. I bolted up the steps, my boots slipping on the wet stones. My lungs burned as I forced the icy air into my chest. 20 paces to the door. 19. 18. Behind me, from the bottom of the pit, came a sound that made my skin crawl. It was my mother's voice, but it was screaming, a high, piercing shriek of pure terror that was suddenly joined by the voices of dozens of other people I didn't know. Mark, the roots are in my eyes. Don't let the glass break. If the glass breaks, the signal dies. I reached the top of the cellar stairs, grabbed the heavy oak handle of the door, and threw my weight against it. The door burst open into the ground floor hallway. The house was completely unrecognizable. The floorboards of the corridor were gone, replaced by a dense, pulsing carpet of gray roots that twisted and coiled over the joists. The wallpaper was no longer floral. It was covered in a thick, yellowish slime that dripped down the walls, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent light that cast long, distorted shadows across the ceiling. Entry 431. My own voice echoed from the walls, flat and mechanical. The time is half gone. The stairs are narrowing. The wood is turning into flesh. I jumped onto the exposed floor joists, balancing precariously as I made my way toward the second-floor staircase. Beneath my feet, in the dark gaps between the timbers, I could see the pale, spindly limbs of the roots reaching upward, their tips covered in tiny, twitching hairs that brushed against the soles of my boots. The stairs leading to the second floor were buckling. The heavy oak steps were curving inward, the wood softening like wet cardboard. I scrambled up the stairs on my hands and knees. The wood felt warm now, hot, even, and it gave off a sickening, sweet odor like burning fat. My fingers sank into the steps, the rotting fibers sticking to my skin. "Don't go up, Mark," my father's voice whispered from the banister. His tone was gentle, reasonable, just like it used to be. "It's so much easier down here. The roots don't hurt. They just take the heavy things out of your head. You don't have to be afraid of being broke anymore. You don't have to be alone." I gritted my teeth and pulled myself onto the second floor landing. The corridor was a tunnel of pulsing, gray wood. The hole I had carved in the plaster earlier was almost entirely closed, the edges of the wallpaper knitting together like the lips of a wound. But I could still see the fifth window at the end of the hall. The glass was glowing. Behind the dark antique panes, the swirling black static was moving violently, sending bright, jagged sparks of blue light through the corridor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy steel-headed hammer I had dropped earlier. My fingers were slippery with the yellowish sap, but I gripped the handle with both hands. I took 3 long, clumsy strides across the pulsing floorboards, raised the hammer over my shoulder, and swung it directly at the center of the glass. Clang! The hammer bounced off the antique glass with a heavy, vibrating sound that nearly shook the tool from my hands. The glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Behind the pane, the swirling static stopped. And from the other side of the glass, my father's eyes, the ones made of antique lenses, looked out at me. "Entry 432, he whispered from the wood. "The hammer is too light, Mark. The iron is too soft. To break the lens, you need something that belongs to the house." The vibration from the hammer's impact traveled up my arms like an electric shock, leaving my fingers numb and tingling. I stood on the pulsing, spongy wood of the second floor corridor, my breath turning into rapid white clouds in the sudden, freezing draft that was now blowing directly from the cracks in the ceiling. The glass of the fifth window was unbroken. The hammer had left nothing but a pale, greasy smudge on the dark antique pane. Behind the glass, the 2 circular lenses that served as the creature's eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, but the swirling black static within them began to pulse in time with the rhythmic thudding coming from beneath the floor. Thump! 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 The tall one was rising from the cellar. I could hear its multi-jointed limbs snapping as they squeezed into the narrow corridor of the first floor, moving with terrifying speed toward the staircase. "The hammer is too light, Mark," my father's voice whispered again, echoing not from the walls, but from the very center of my own skull. "The iron belongs to the earth. To break the glass, you must use the wood. You must use the anchor." I looked down at the hammer in my hand. He was right. The tool was an outsider here. It didn't belong to the ancient, rotting circuit of the house. I looked at the window frame itself. It was made of the same dark, water-stained walnut as the chair in the hidden room. The wood was heavy, dense, and weeping that same yellowish sap from every joint. And then I saw it. Lodged deep into the lower sill of the window frame was a heavy, rusted iron hinge, a relic from when the sealed room was still part of the original house. The metal was thick, jagged, and fused with the timber by decades of rust and rot. I threw the hammer aside. It fell onto the floorboards with a soft, wet thud, sinking an inch into the spongy wood before the gray fibers began to curl around the steel head. I gripped the rusted hinge with both hands. Entry 433. The voice of Dr. Eris rattled from the ceiling beams above my head. It was fading now, becoming distorted by the sound of rushing air. The subject is attempting to strip the casing. He is touching the old iron. The circuit is resisting. The moment my bare fingers clamped around the rusted metal, the house let out a terrible, vibrating shriek. A current of pure, raw electricity, or something that felt like it shot up my arms. My vision went white, and for a second, I couldn't see the corridor. I saw the forest. I saw the roots of the dark pines reaching miles down into the black earth, drinking from a dark, subterranean river of thick, bubbling sap. I saw my grandmother. She wasn't dead. She was sitting in the high-backed walnut chair inside the sealed room, her skin the color of lard, her eyes already replaced by the cold, antique glass. "Mark," she whispered in my mind. "The hinge holds the weight of the floorboards. If you pull it, the frame falls. If the frame falls, the glass has nothing to hold against." "Let go of me," I screamed. I planted my boots against the wall, leaning back with my entire body weight. My muscles burned, the skin on my palms tearing against the jagged, rusted edges of the iron hinge. My blood, warm, bright red, and full of my own living pulse, dripped onto the dark walnut frame. The moment my blood touched the wood, the yellowish sap on the sill began to boil. The wood screamed, a high, piercing sound that sounded like a dry branch breaking in a storm. Crack! The iron hinge ripped out of the walnut frame, bringing a thick, heavy shard of the dark timber with it. The wood was jagged, pointed, and soaked in my own blood and the creature's sap. Entry 434. The creature's voice boomed. This time it wasn't just one voice. It was a chaotic, overlapping storm of everyone who had ever died in Blackwood Creek. The anchor has the wood. The circuit is broken. The floor beneath my feet gave way. The gray roots snapped, and I fell forward, my knees hitting the windowsill. But I didn't let go of the shard of walnut timber. I raised it over my shoulder with both hands and drove the jagged, blood-soaked point directly into the center of the antique glass. Smash! The fifth window didn't just break, it exploded. A blinding, violent wave of blue light rushed out from the hidden room, knocking me backward onto the corridor landing. The tattered, rotted remains of the velvet curtain were caught in the blast, turning into fine, white ash that filled the air. And from behind the shattered glass, the figure let out a sound. It was a wet, rattling gasp, the sound of a long-held breath finally being released. The swirling black static in its eyes vanished, leaving only the empty, clear panes of antique glass that reflected the dim, overcast sky outside. The long, multi-jointed arms went limp, falling to its sides as its 9-foot frame began to shrivel and turn gray. But the house wasn't done. The blue light from the shattered window was spreading along the corridor, turning the gray, pulsing roots into white ash. The ceiling beams were snapping, and the heavy stone walls of the second floor were beginning to tilt inward. "Go, Mark!" my mother's voice shrieked from the stairs. But this time, the voice was coming from the real world, from the open front door on the ground floor. "Run! The house is going back into the earth." I didn't look back at the shriveled thing in the sealed room. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself down the buckling, rotting stairs. The stairs didn't just creak as I fled. They dissolved beneath my boots. The wood, once solid oak and then a sickening mimicry of muscle, was now nothing but a collapsing web of dry, white ash. I didn't walk, I plunged. I fell through the gaps where the steps had been, my shoulders slamming against the exposed joists of the first floor before I tumbled onto the dirt and rubble of the ground floor hallway. The blinding blue light from the second floor was cascading down the stairwell like a physical wave, turning every pulsing root it touched into dust. The air was a choking, heavy cloud of ozone and sulfur. Entry 435. The creature's voice whispered from the ceiling, but it was weak now. It sounded like a phonograph running out of spring, the words slowing down, dragging, and warping into static. "The lens is empty. The transmission has ceased. The marrow is returning to the soil. I dragged myself toward the front door. The heavy timber frame was buckling, the stone lintel above it cracking under the immense weight of the collapsing upper floors. I reached up with my bloodied hands, grabbed the edge of the threshold, and hauled myself out of the house. The moment my boots hit the gravel of the courtyard, I didn't stop. I kept crawling, scrambling on my hands and knees over the sharp stones, until I was 50 feet away, collapsing against the cold, rusted metal of my dead sedan. I turned around and looked at Blackwood Manor. The entire second floor was glowing with that brilliant, ethereal blue fire. Through the empty, jagged frame of the fifth window, I could see the shriveled, gray silhouette of the tall one. It wasn't moving. The antique glass lenses in its face had shattered into 1,000 tiny sparks of light that were now drifting upward into the darkening sky like fireflies. With a long, drawn-out groan that sounded like a sigh, the center of the house collapsed inward. The walls of blackened timber and hand-cut stone folded into the cellar, pulling the roof, the chimney, and the sealed room down into the yawning pit below. A massive cloud of white ash and blue dust erupted from the crater, obscuring the sky for several minutes. And then the silence returned. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had sat over the courtyard for 3 days was gone. The air felt clean, cold, and smelled of nothing but damp earth and evening rain. I sat on the gravel, my breath coming in ragged gasps, watching the last of the blue dust settle over the ruins. My car's engine suddenly roared to life behind me. Vroom! The starter motor, which had been choked with that sickening sap just hours ago, was running smoothly. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the twilight and casting 2 long, clear beams across the empty space where the manor had stood. I didn't pack. I didn't look for my laptop or my clothes. I climbed into the driver's seat, threw the car into reverse, and tore down the gravel driveway. 1 year later, I live in a small, third-floor apartment in the city now. It's loud, it's cramped, and the air smells of exhaust fumes and cheap grease, and I have never been happier. I haven't written a single word of fiction since that night. Instead, I work as a proofreader for a local legal firm. I like things that are rigid. I like things that are real. I like words that have only one meaning. But I still have the blueprints of Blackwood Manor. I keep them locked in a heavy iron firebox beneath my bed. Sometimes, when the city is quiet and the rain is tapping against my window, I pull the faded parchment out and look at the eastern facade. The sketch still shows only 4 windows. But 3 weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, only a postmark from the mountains north of the city. Inside the box was a single, heavy object wrapped in tattered, rotted velvet. It was a small, perfectly circular pane of antique glass, held in place by a dark, scarred piece of lead casing. It was completely clear, but when I held it up to the light of my desk lamp, I didn't see my reflection. I saw a narrow, dark corridor. I saw a high-backed walnut chair, and on the glass, written in the fog of a breath that wasn't mine, were 3 words in reverse. "We see you."